Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains adorable. And today, we're going to discuss trolleys, or sometimes called rail cars, depends who you ask. The same thing, it's these. It's the buses that run on rails, except they're better than buses. Buses. Bleh. Trolleys. I like trolleys better, okay? I do. We're going to discuss not them specifically, even though I've been looking for an excuse to, because frankly I very much like trolleys. No, we're going to discuss the history of a particular trolley museum, the National Capital Trolley Museum, or NCTM. They are a non-profit organization that is, well, a heritage railway basically, except they specialize in trolleys. There's quite a few of these that dot the landscape over the continental United States, but NCTM has had a pretty rough history, and despite that, they still remain open to this day. So let's talk about the tragedy, yet survival, of the National Capital Trolley Museum. The actual organization was established in 1959, and they're located at 1313 Bonifant Road, Colesville, Maryland. Just in case you want to visit, because they are still there to this day. They were officially incorporated on January 4th, 1961, as the National Capital Historic Museum of Transportation, Incorporated. They had a bit of a rough start. It just didn't take off as well as they had hoped, but they managed to combine their efforts as well as streetcar collections with another group that was located in Baltimore. With more manpower and more rolling stock, it naturally attracted a lot more attention. And their current location was not their first. They originally started in Lake Roland Park in Baltimore, Maryland. However, that just did not go smoothly at all. See, their first problem, their first real hiccup in their history, is that adjacent property owners complained about them being there. Because as you know, trolleys are notorious for making just so much noise. No. Buses and cars and everything else, they don't make any noise pollution. But the trolleys, oh my god, they're so loud, aren't they? Man, that clicky clack down the track, so scary. Can't deal with it. As a result, the groups divided their collections again in 1966, while the Baltimore Streetcar Museum was formed to focus on Baltimore transit instead. They're still around too, for what it's worth, but that's not who we're talking about specifically. NCTM's new site was actually provided by the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, and DC Transit actually leased trolleys for a nominal cost. They wound up being able to raise $20,000 to build a barn, and groundbreaking on the site began on November 20th, 1965. The original intention of the organization was to operate cars that were specifically owned by the DC Transit president, O. Roy Chalk. But Chalk actually didn't donate elements of his collection until 1970. During the time before that, the museum actually got a hold of a small fleet of European trams, as well as a car from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. They ran their first streetcar in October of 1969, and since then they've operated consistently over their 1-mile line. Like any proper railway museum, their goals align with both preservation and education, teaching people about these historic rail cars, what they were for, what they were good at, and just the general history of things. It's a very nice insight into the past and the way things used to be. Since they're non-profit, they fund themselves with membership dues, donations, as well as volunteer service. That's not unusual at all. A lot of places like this are strictly volunteers. But because they're volunteers, they are people that genuinely care about what they're doing. If you get people to volunteer for something, I mean, they can almost be better than a paid employee, because in some cases, a paid employee is just there for the paycheck. But with volunteers, you know they care about the job. You know they care about this equipment. You know they care about the history. But like I said, they've had a pretty tumultuous history when it comes to accidents, mostly involving fire. It's an unfortunate thing that does sometimes happen, though in this case, at least one incident involved the intentional destruction of at least one piece of equipment. The first incident happened in 1970, and it involved their unique air-conditioned PCC car, number 1512. It was known as the Silver Sightseer, but in that year, it was set on fire by arsonists, and it had to be scrapped. It was damaged completely beyond repair, and that was a tremendous loss, as like I said, that was a kind of unique piece. Then in 1987, cars 1053 and 766 were severely damaged in a collision, but they weren't actually scrapped, fortunately. But the worst disaster that ever fell on them also involved fire, and it was September 28th, 2003. One of their two car barns at their former site burned down completely. 8 pieces of equipment, comprising half their total operating fleet and 1/3 of their total collection, was destroyed. The Washington cars that were lost included 0509, 1053, 07, and 026. The Johnstown cars that were destroyed were 352, Graz 120, and their Vienna cars, 6062 and 7802, were also destroyed. The actual cause of the fire was not definitively determined. No one seems sure exactly why it happened, but the fire inspector did conclude that it was accidental this time. It was not a case of arson, so at least this wasn't on purpose by some criminal element. This was just a tragic accident. A few of these cars were actually one of a kind, such as 1053 and 07. They were the only preserved examples of their specific designs, and now they are gone. Trolleys often are made of wood, especially older ones, and even the newer ones are very thin metal. They are not okay when it comes to a fire, and they cannot be rebuilt. I mean, you can rebuild them from scratch, but that's violently expensive, and it wouldn't even be the same trolley anymore. The preservation element is gone entirely once you do that. A few of the others do have sisters in other places that are still around, but this is still a tragic loss for the rail preservation community. Following the fire, the museum still trucked forward though, amazingly despite their tremendous loss. They still had remaining rolling stock, so they could still continue forward, and since then, the museum has been able to purchase more streetcars from other museums, or trade with them to replace those that were lost. There's a bit of a fellowship among museum owners when it comes to this kind of thing, and they generally try to reach out and help each other when they can. In the winter of 2008 into 2009, they moved into 3 new buildings: a visitor center, a display building for their streetcars known as Streetcar Hall, as well as a streetcar maintenance building. Construction of the Inter-County Connector, or ICC, not that one, this is totally different, which is a toll road, required the museum to shift from their former location. But they reopened January 16, 2010, and the new buildings are actually gorgeous. Generally being forced to move because of a highway project is a bad thing for any kind of location, but in their case, it seems to have breathed new life into them since the 2003 fire. Their current collections sit in 3 categories: the DC collection, which was their original focus, the American collection, which has streetcars from all over America, and they still have a lot of their European trams that they purchased, so they have an international collection too. Under the DC collection, they have DC Transit 1101, Capital Traction Company 522, Capital Traction Company 09, Capital Traction Company 27, Washington Railway and Electric Company 650, Capital Transit Company 1430, Capital Transit Company 1470, and Capital Transit Company 1540. Under the American collection, they only have a couple of trolleys: 3rd Avenue Railway System 678, and Philadelphia and Westchester Traction Company number 85. Then among their international collection is a Toronto Transit Commission 4602, a Toronto Transit Commission 4603, a Blackpool Transit Services 606, a Tramweg something, I'm not even, 1329, a Berliner Werks of, goodness, 5954. No, 955. A Société des Transports Intercommunaux de Bruxelles, 1069. A Société des Transports Intercommunaux de Bruxelles, 17. And same thing again, 9060. On top of their two Canadians, their international collection is interesting for America since we have a bunch of European trolleys. You don't see them very often over here, so they're really cool to see. And much of their collection is in operation, and the stuff that isn't is in the process of being refurbished for that purpose. It's nice to see these trolleys being preserved and cared for in such a real way, and hopefully the worst days of this museum are behind them, and they can continue forward, preserving history for future generations for years to come. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Some267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's River Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Racer 78, Ohio Trucker 1, Lord Hoth 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, that guy with the beard, NG5, Mark Holding, Mercenary Revy, Lock Kraken, and Crystal Morgan. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.